We don't know when exactly Jesus was born, but it's likely to have been around 5 BC. At the time, the Roman Empire dominated almost all of the known world, from the pyramids of Egypt to the west coast of Spain. The Romans worshipped many different gods, from Jupiter, the god of thunder, to Mars, the god of war. It looked like this would continue, with the Romans incorporating new gods as they conquered new people.
However, although nobody knew it at the time, the newborn baby of Judea would change the world more than anyone could have imagined.
The life of Christ is shrouded in mystery, but modern historians broadly agree on 3 things. He was born shortly before the year 1. He was baptized by John the Baptist, and he was crucified by the Roman Pontius Pilate. His life is detailed at length in the Bible, but many of those stories are controversial amongst historians. Jesus likely began preaching around the year 25 AD in the region of Galilee. After a few years, he was accused of stoking an insurrection, for which he was crucified in Jerusalem.
At the time of his death, Jesus had only a few hundred followers. It was up to them to spread his message to the world. One of the most important disciples was Paul, the apostle. Early in his life, Paul had persecuted Christians, but had then converted and travelled the Mediterranean, spreading the faith. He would eventually end up in Rome, where he was met by Peter, another important disciple. Peter would become the first pope and gave his name to the magnificent St. Peter's Basilica. However, in the year 64 AD, the Great Fire of Rome broke out, which Emperor Nero blamed on Christians. Both Peter and Paul were executed. Nevertheless, other Christians continued spreading the word and writing the New Testament. By the end of the 1st century, the Bible was complete. For the next 200 years, Christians would be brutally persecuted in the Roman Empire. Churches were destroyed and Bibles were burned. Worshippers were even fed to lions in Rome's famous Colosseum. The Roman Empire was doing everything that it could to eradicate Christianity. Despite this brutal persecution, people continued to convert. By the year 300, roughly 10% of the Roman Empire was Christian. The event that would do more than any other to further the spread of Christianity came in 312 AD. The Roman Empire was engulfed in a civil war over who was the rightful emperor. One claimant, named Constantine, was preparing for battle when he had an experience that would change history. He looked up at the night sky and saw a cross burning through the clouds. The next day he won the Battle of Milvian Bridge, securing himself the empire. Having been favoured by the Christian God, Constantine repaid the favour and legalized Christianity throughout the entire Roman Empire. As the religion grew, theological disputes began to emerge amongst believers. The Docetists, for example, believed that Christ had never had human form, that he was merely a god or a spirit. Other Christians rejected this, believing that Christ must have been human, otherwise he could not have suffered. If he had not suffered, he could not have sacrificed himself for humanity's sins. Many such disputes emerged, which Emperor Constantine wanted resolved. In 325 AD, he called the Council of Nicaea, where hundreds of bishops met to determine the true interpretation of Christianity. The main disagreements surrounded the nature of Christ himself and his relationship with God. Were they the same or were they separate? And if they were separate, was one superior to the other? The assembly eventually agreed on one interpretation that became known as the Nicene Creed. With that, the religion grew and grew, quickly becoming half the empire's population. In 335 AD, the Church of Holy Sepulchre was consecrated on the site where Jesus had been crucified. It remains the holiest church in the world. As Christianity grew stronger, the Roman Empire became weaker, culminating in the fall of Rome to Germanic tribes. The eastern half of the empire remained and came to be known as the Byzantine Empire. Its capital, Constantinople, was now the most important city in Christendom. Many Byzantine emperors aspired to reconquer the lost territories, and Emperor Justinian did manage to reconquer Rome. However, in the 600s AD, Christendom would face a huge new threat with the rise of Islam. The Byzantines lost huge amounts of territory to the Muslims, most painfully the holy city of Jerusalem. This left Constantinople and Rome as the two centres of Christianity, and the two cities quickly became rivals. It began in 726 when the Byzantine Emperor Leo III prohibited the worship of images of Christ. Pictures and sculptures were destroyed, and those that wished to worship them were punished. This came to be known as iconoclasm and was strongly opposed by the Pope in Rome. Relations deteriorated further in 751 when Rome came under threat from the Lombards. Rome was technically within the Byzantine Empire, so protection should have come from Constantinople. However, the Pope instead sought protection from the Franks, who successfully drove the Lombards away. The Franks then took Rome and the land around it from the Byzantine Empire and gave it to the Pope. This was significant. Rome and the papacy were now officially outside of the Byzantine Empire. The next blow to the relationship came in the late 700s with the rise of Charlemagne the Great. He was a powerful king and a champion of Christianity, spreading the faith all over Europe. In 800 AD, the Pope invited him to Rome, where he was crowned Holy Roman Emperor. This further damaged relations between Rome and Constantinople. Only one person could be the legitimate heir to the Roman Empire, so the crowning of Charlemagne was a direct challenge to the Byzantine Empress Irene. Disagreements continued over the next centuries. In 863, a dispute emerged over who got to choose the Bishop of Constantinople. Known as the Phocian controversy, it was only just resolved with an uneasy compromise. The dispute that would finally destroy the relationship came in 1054. It related to rituals that took place in church services. Over time, slight differences had emerged in the way that Eastern and Western churches carried out those rituals. The Pope demanded that all churches in Italy stop following the Eastern tradition, or they would be closed. The Bishop of Constantinople was of course outraged by this and returned the favour, closing all Western churches in the Byzantine Empire. Finally, a letter of excommunication was laid on the altar of the Hagia Sophia. This was known as the Great Schism. Christendom was split, never again to be united. As much as this rift had already hurt Christianity, it would cause yet more harm in the future. However, in the late 11th century, the most pressing issue facing Christendom was the rise of the Seljuk Turks. In 1071, they defeated the Byzantines at the Battle of Manzikert and took almost all of Anatolia. The Byzantine Empire was in grave danger, and the emperor appealed to Pope Urban II for military assistance. The Pope obliged, sensing an opportunity to improve relations. He called on all European knights to aid their Christian brothers and retake Jerusalem from the Muslims. Any who fought to retake the Holy Land would have all their sins forgiven. Thousands of men volunteered with the hope of saving their souls from damnation. This First Crusade had more success than anyone could have imagined, and in 1099 Jerusalem was retaken for Christianity. The conquered territory became known as the Kingdom of Jerusalem. It would, however, be reconquered by the Muslims soon after. Many more crusades were launched over the next centuries, but none came close to the stunning success of the first. Despite this moment of unity within Christendom, the division between East and West would soon again rear its head. In Constantinople, there was resentment towards rich Italian merchants who were buying up large amounts of land. These members of the Western Church became increasingly hated by the Greeks, culminating in a massacre of the Latin population in 1182. The two halves of Christendom now viewed each other as out-and-out enemies. This led to one of the worst disasters in all of Christian history. 2 decades after the massacre, Latin warriors of the Fourth Crusade sacked Constantinople. This was a catastrophe from which the Byzantine Empire never recovered. Gradually, it lost territory to the Ottomans, and in 1453, Constantinople itself fell. The Byzantine Empire ceased to exist. Today, the fall of Constantinople is viewed as one of the most important events in human history. However, at the time, many in Western Europe were too preoccupied with their own affairs to pay much attention. Many were focused on fighting heresy, the most famous example being the Spanish Inquisition. Jews and Muslims were forced to convert to Christianity or leave.
This was to ensure the supremacy of Roman Catholicism in Spain. In 1492, the expedition of Christopher Columbus led to the discovery of the Americas, and the native people were peacefully or forcefully converted. This massive expansion in land and population was a huge success for Christendom. However, the Christian world was about to be hit by an enormous crisis, a crisis that would cause chaos and violence for centuries. It started in 1511 when a monk named Martin Luther wrote a list of criticisms of the Catholic Church and then sent the list to various powerful nobles. The list became known as the 95 Theses and became one of the most explosive documents in history. The criticisms mainly focused on the corruption in the Catholic Church, in particular the practice of selling the absolution of sin. Luther argued that forgiveness could come from God alone, not from financial gifts to the Catholic Church. His arguments quickly became popular and he became hugely famous. Equally important was his translation of the Bible into German, which made the population less reliant on the clergy. Now people could read the Bible themselves. The Catholic Emperor ordered Luther's death, but his fame provided him protection. He had become so popular that his execution could have triggered a civil war.
This rejection of the Catholic Church became known as the Reformation and gave rise to a new branch of Christianity called Protestantism.
Similar events occurred in other areas of the Christian world. In Switzerland, a Christian leader named John Calvin made similar arguments to Luther and began the Reformation there. In England, Henry VIII was enraged when the Pope refused to grant him a divorce. He declared that he would be the authority on all religious matters in England and cut ties with the Catholic Church. He then closed the Catholic monasteries in England and stripped them of their assets.
The Pope responded to the Reformation by calling the Council of Trent, which lasted almost 2 decades. Many aspects of Christian theology were addressed, including the corrupt practices that had led to the Reformation. These reforms did go some way towards reducing discontent, but Protestantism was now entrenched and here to stay.
The divide between the two faiths would go on to cause unimaginable destruction within Europe. The French Wars of Religion broke out in 1562 and lasted almost 4 decades. They ended with the Edict of Nantes, which declared that France would remain Catholic, but Protestantism would be permitted. The worst conflict was the 30 Years' War, which began in 1618 in Central Europe. It went on to be one of the most destructive wars in European history, and some areas saw their populations halve.
However, while this period was plagued with conflict, it also saw the creation of magnificent art and music, much of it inspired by Christianity. Composers such as Mozart and Bach wrote choral music to be sung at Mass. Artists created masterpieces such as Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper or Michelangelo's Creation of Adam. Architecture also reached peaks never before seen with the building of the Sistine Chapel and St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Modernity did, however, bring new challenges, particularly with the rise of science. In 1610, Galileo published his observations of the planets, which promoted the view that the Earth is not the center of the universe and in fact goes around the Sun. The Catholic Church declared this heresy and condemned Galileo to house arrest for the rest of his life. An even bigger challenge came in 1859 when Charles Darwin published The Origin of Species. This introduced the theory of evolution, and with it the idea that man was not made by God, but had evolved from animals. Many Christian leaders rejected the idea totally. Others attempted to reconcile it with Christianity, arguing that evolution was guided by God. Today, Christianity is the world's largest religion with almost 3 billion followers. The Bible is the best-selling publication of all time with over 5 billion copies sold. The biggest challenge for Christianity in the 21st century is likely to be the rise of atheism and decreased interest in religion. That said, we can be certain that the teachings of Christ will be a key part of human history for centuries to come.